Of all the world's economies, one is becoming increasingly hard to ignore. India. An economy which may finally be on the brink of doing something it hasn't done in over 3 centuries. Fulfill its economic potential. Currently ranked 5th in GDP terms, by the end of the decade, India is expected to overtake both Germany and Japan to reach the top 3, and from there, take on the might of China and even the US. In 2023, it officially toppled China to claim the title of the world's biggest population, one that is set to grow well into the mid-century, whilst China's will rapidly decline and languish into a demographic nightmare. Combine that with the news that the likes of Apple are expanding and opening production plants in India, and it appears inevitable that India will be the next China. But what actually does that mean? The next China? Online forums, social media and newspapers alike are littered with articles predicting India will be the next China. But it's the how and the when more than the will be, which is far more interesting. Almost as interesting as our free newsletter, Ripple Report, a 5-minute read twice a month on the not-so-obvious secondary impacts of global economic events. The link to which is in the description below. Now back to the video. If India will or won't be the next China, then understanding how China got to where it is may just tell us how India can get there as well. So, how did China and India get to where they are today? First, we need to go back to the 60s, 1962 to be precise. The year that China split from the Soviet Union, otherwise known as the Sino-Soviet split. And bear with me, because this is important. Whilst both countries remained communist, this would have huge implications for China down the line. Following the old saying that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the US saw this as a golden opportunity to divide communist states and hurt its bitter rival, the Soviet Union. But they would have to wait patiently until 1979 for the right opportunity. An opportunity which would only arrive after the death of Chairman Mao and, crucially, a new Chinese government, which enabled China to open up to Western investment through free trade and enterprise zones, where Western companies flooded in to capitalise upon the vast amounts of cheap labour. Now, at this point you may be wondering, why didn't Western factories flood into India? After all, it was a democracy and not a communist state. Well, that's because India operated under a weird blend of Soviet-style 5-year plans and a post-colonial capitalist market, dominated by a few large state-backed industries. During this period, it had deep ties with the Soviet Union, spanning geopolitics, military alliances, and food programs. But what this really meant was that whilst on paper, China was the communist state, the economic reality was that in the 80s and 90s, China embraced capitalist ideals much more than India did. Ultimately, China's economy was privatized much faster, its labor market underwent deeper reforms, and the economy opened up to international trade through lower tariffs and foreign investment policies much quicker. All this economic jazz meant that despite the disaster of China's economic policies in the 1960s and 70s, by 1991, your average Chinese citizen was richer than their Indian counterpart. This isn't to say that the 90s didn't see India also embrace economic reforms as well, but they only did it half-heartedly to comply with IMF bailout terms, whereas China went full steam ahead, resulting in their GDPs per capita diverging dramatically. China went on an economic rampage to around $13,000 today, whereas India somewhat lagged behind to around $2,500, a 5-fold difference. Over the years, much has been made of China's success, though it's largely accepted that becoming the world's factory had a large part to play in it, with China's share of industrial output growing to over 1/3, whilst India's remains below 3%, massively underperforming relative to its potential. So, for a country like India with a workforce of hundreds of millions of cheap labourers, estimated to at least be 3 times cheaper than China's, the decision seems obvious. All India has to do now is become the world's next factory. And surprise, surprise, this is actually India's official government policy, planning to raise India's share of manufacturing to 25% of all GDP by 2025. However, this has proved somewhat more difficult in practice, explaining why the target was extended after it was initially missed in 2022. In fact, the share of manufacturing in India's GDP has actually gone into reverse, declining from 15% when the policy was first announced to 13% in 2022. Not being that low since the 1960s. What's more strange is that this has all occurred during a period where global supply chains were meant to be shifting away from China, leading us nicely onto our next question. What advantage does China have over India? The big difference between the time when China rose to become a manufacturing superman and today is where these jobs are being taken from. For the last 40 years, China has by and large been taking these jobs, and market share for that matter, from wealthy developed economies, where comparative wage costs and the general cost to produce items were much higher, and almost from a unique standpoint in human history, free trade and deindustrialization were widely celebrated. India, on the other hand, will not be competing to the same extent with developed nations, but similar low-wage economies such as Vietnam, Indonesia and Bangladesh, with profit margins just being far slimmer and less lucrative. Not to mention that the big boy on the factory block, China, is far more willing and able to prevent its market share declining through its centralized state-backed industrial base than fragmented high-income countries were in the past. Even with India's cheaper labour, which admittedly is a great advantage, you also need to balance that against the productivity of that labour. As things currently stand, Chinese manufacturing adds a lot of value, adding 5 times the value when you account for value creation across the entire supply chain. You see, on a national scale, it's not just the costs of producing one component or widget, it's how this all fits together across the entire supply chain which produces the end product. At the level of the individual worker, Chinese workers are also much more literate and have a higher life expectancy than their Indian counterparts, which can be taken as rough indicators of the scale of the gap that employers face in both countries. Also helping to explain why defects rates at Apple's new Indian factory were as high as 50%. But that's enough about China's advantages. On a more positive note, what can India do? You might assume that if India wants to be a manufacturing powerhouse, one of the key things it could do was attract more foreign direct investment year on year to help build factories, roads and expensive science parks. Surprisingly, India's foreign direct investment has been on the decline, and it's projected to fall further in 2024. As a proportion of GDP, India's FDI is set to be at its lowest level in decades. A bit of a shock given all the headlines and high-profile companies setting up factories. Related to this is where exactly this money is coming from. Presumably that would be the likes of the US, the EU, or even China. But no. The largest source of India's investment is Singapore, followed by the tiny Indian archipelago of Mauritius. A reflection more of India's tax treaties, which make it far more tax efficient to set up companies in these microstates than their main economic players directly. Not exactly creating a straightforward investment environment. And that's just one example of the barriers businesses face. Barriers like the insane levels of red tape businesses have to go through. Just to buy a piece of land to build a factory on can involve hundreds of signatures, dozens of permits, and take decades. Something backed up when you look at the nation's ranking in terms of ease of doing business, featuring all the way down at 63rd. A massive drawback for foreign corporations, which is largely within its own ability to solve. These barriers even affect sectors identified for the nation's Made in India transformation. For example, the government charges its electronic manufacturers higher import tariffs than compared to its main competitors. A study by India's Cellular and Electronics Association found it charged more than China or Vietnam. In fact, Vietnam is an excellent example. Back in 2010, both India and Vietnam exported a similar dollar amount of electronics. Fast forward to 2022, and Vietnam's value has increased 38-fold. Whilst India's hasn't even doubled. Many business investors and researchers alike put this down to Hanoi's lower tariffs and free trade agreements, providing their factories lower input costs to compete on the world stage. In fairness, this isn't to say that India hasn't reduced its tariffs over time, being considerably lower than they were in the 90s or even the 2000s. It's just, well, other countries did it quicker. Taking a step back though, does India even need to attract massive amounts of FDI? Surely its rise at this point is inevitable. Well, no, not quite. To help give you an idea of the scale of the task facing India, its value add from manufacturing stood at $455 billion, a decent number, until you realize that China's same figure was $4.9 trillion, implying that even if India's manufacturing grew at an impressive 8% per year without fail over the next 30 years, and China stayed absolutely stagnant, it still wouldn't be as big. When you look at it like this, then India's need for foreign capital becomes not just a nice to have, but essential. Especially when talking about manufacturing, an incredibly capital-intensive business activity which requires more supporting infrastructure through roads, bridges, rails, ports and utilities than it does to build the actual factory. All expensive pieces of kit and tarmac, which the Indian government doesn't really have the fiscal headroom to finance by itself, having an unusually high level of debt to GDP compared to the amount that China had at a similar level of development. This begs the question, Can India just leapfrog manufacturing straight to a service-based economy? Traditional theories of economic development believe economies all develop along a similar path, starting out in agriculture before transitioning to manufacturing and then finally to services. But with all we just discussed, maybe India can follow its own path. After all, India already has the world's second largest English-speaking population, a vibrant tech sector with countless large Western companies outsourcing not just call centers, but everything from accounting to even legal departments to India. Financially, this looks extremely attractive as well. Taking US tech giant Apple as an example, it doesn't physically produce its own iPhones, but acts as the design, marketing and innovation hub. Instead, it outsources that to Taiwanese manufacturer Foxconn, but Apple's market cap is around $3 trillion, whereas Foxconn's is less than $100 billion. With the rise of remote working and work-from-home culture, much to the annoyance of those still having to commute to the office, it's perfectly plausible that India becomes to services what China has been to manufacturing. The advantage to India here is that as a democracy and with a much better PR image than the Chinese government, gaining access to more sensitive business data from London, Paris or New York is far more likely. Whatever India decides though, it may need to do it quickly. India's demographic dividend, that being its relatively young population, gets a lot of attention as a major advantage over China. However, a less talked about stat is its anticipated peak working age population relative to its total population. Basically, how many people there are of working age compared to the total population. China reached its peak in the early 2000s after decades of consistently high growth. India is expected to reach its own lower peak in 2030, way before the total population tops out at around 2060. After 2030, a combination of higher life expectancy and lower replacement rates will start to drag on the economy, presenting India with a narrow window to capitalise on its demographic dividend if it truly wants to become the next China, whatever that means. Now, if you've been watching the video this long, as a bonus you may have noticed an Easter egg somewhere in the video, providing a clue on the next topic. Let me know in the comments below if you can find it. Please also consider giving us a like or subscribing, it really helps grow the channel. Until the next video, stay curious.